lessons for the Latin American Caribbean regions that we are organizing today with our world business partner, Intervistas. This is one of the multiple webinars that we have developed in collaboration with them. Now this time in a very interesting topic and relevant topic here in the region. And actually, just to share with you, and this will be mentioned in the presentation, Intervistas conducted the study and the ACI policy brief on airport charges that we have shared with you all last year. Before starting, I would like to introduce to our speakers today, Dr. Mike Tertewey, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Intervistas, Jody Kositsky, Senior Director of Intervistas, and Marcelo Garcia, Senior Director of Intervistas. Before giving the floor to Marcelo, I would like to remind you that we have interpretation, as we usually do. For our webinars, you only need to select the channel of your preference in the Zoom menu. And in case you listen to the speaker's voice and the interpretation at the same time, please, to avoid that, select the last option that says mute original audio. The questions will be addressed at the end. The chat function, that you could notice, is not enabled. So please send your questions to the email address that you find on the screen, info@aci-lac.aero. And as I said, these the questions will be addressed at the end of the session. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Marcelo, which will give also a brief introduction from the Intervistas side. Thank you all.
Thank you, Francisco, for your words, and thank you for the ACI team, to the ACI team of for the Caribbean and Latin America, for this opportunity to present some of our practical areas of Intervistas. At the same time, I want to wish you a good morning, good afternoon to all of you. We have a long tradition in economic and analysis and regulation with different projects in Latin America, including projects, as Francisco mentioned, directly with ACI. As director responsible for the continent, I have invited two of my colleagues, Jody, an esteemed colleague, a great professional for economic analysis. Jody has a master's degree in air transportation, maritime transportation from a European university. And today she will introduce some points for instance, evolution of airport charges, how they've been evolving throughout the years, and what we see towards the future. I have also invited our colleague from several years back, Mike Trethewey, Dr. Mike Trethewey. Well, what can I say about Mike? He's an authority in the area. He has worked in this area more than 40 years. He has a PhD from Wisconsin University in the United States, and he has been working in Intervistas practices at the highest levels. But we always keep learning from him, and we always listen to his advice, and we're very pleased to have him with us. And without any further ado, I will introduce them so they start their presentations. Well, and I repeat once again, we're very pleased to participate in this webinar. Thank you. Go ahead, please. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and thank you very much to ACI Latin America and Caribbean. As Marcelo mentioned, my name is Jody Kositsky, and I'll be the main speaker for you today. Dr. Mike Trethewey will be stepping in every so often to provide some additional commentary. But without further ado, next slide, please. Just a quick overview of the webinar program for today. We'll be providing an update on the state of COVID-19 recovery in the LATAM region, as well as reviewing economic regulation and airport airport charges, largely based around the work that we completed with ACI World for their recent policy brief on airport charges and regulation. Next slide, please. We'll start off with the state of COVID-19 recovery in LATAM. Next slide, please. Just to set the stage, before COVID-19 in 2019, passenger traffic in the region was about 690 million passengers. That's roughly 7% of the world passenger traffic. It had been a fairly fast growing region since 2008, and it's forecasted to grow about 4.2% per year out to 2040. There's also about 5% of the world's air cargo moves through the LATAM region. Next slide, please. Looking at what's happened in the region over the past 15 years, there's been consolidation in the airline industry, getting into two large airline groups, LATAM and Avianca. Major domestic markets, including Brazil and Mexico, has seen significant growth in low-cost carriers. As you can see here, growth has gone from 8.5% of the LCC market share in 2005 to 34% in 2019. Next slide, please. At the same time, globally, airport charges have fallen in real terms. Global airport charges per passenger have declined by approximately 20% in real terms in the 5 years up to 2019. Next slide, please. It's a similar story for the region as well. These charts show the evolution of airport charges based on aeronautical revenues reported by airports, mixed into passenger and aircraft-based revenues. Over the past 6 years, the aeronautical revenues generated per passenger in real inflation-adjusted terms have decreased by approximately 26%, so ahead of the global average. Airport charges in the region have decreased and stabilized in real terms, with airports collecting more from passenger-based charges than airline-based charges. Next slide, please. When we look at airport charges as a percent of ticket prices, in the region, it's actually a small percent. We did analysis looking at the airfares plus ancillary charges. So those are an estimate of the extra charges that airlines place on passengers. So that's things like baggage fees, buy on board food options. And we found that airport charges account for only 6.1% of the average airfare in the region. Globally, the number was 5.1%. Next slide, please. There's also indications of traffic rebound in the region. So data from ACI World recently released just last week or 2 weeks ago. 2020 passenger traffic declined 40% of the region's 2019 levels. And by 2022, the region is forecast to recover to 83% of 2019 levels. That is ahead of the global numbers shown here. Next slide, please. And again, this is just showing the quarterly passenger losses due to COVID-19. The light blue bars at the top show projections of lost traffic. And as you can see, the region had quite a drop throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Similar story then for airport revenues. They were also impacted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2020 aeronautical revenues declined to 40% of the region's 2019 levels. And by 2022, it's forecast to recover to 72% of levels. Next slide, please. And this again just shows that same estimate with lost revenue shown as well, a projection of lost revenue. Next slide, please. Given that the industry is still in a state of recovery, we thought it was important to go over economic regulation and airport charges and how this is important for recovery of the industry and in the Latin America, Caribbean region as well. Next slide, please. There we go. So the question is, what is economic regulation? Economic regulation, just defined, is government intervention using economic mechanisms to prevent companies from abusing of their dominant position in the market that lacks competition. Effective competition ensures better outcomes for both consumers and producers than regulation. But sometimes a lack of competition or excess market power remains a concern. Regulation then may be needed under specific conditions, but there is no single theory that helps determine whether an industry should be regulated. The need for regulation then should be determined on a case-by-case basis, and this is an important consideration. Next slide, please. Part of our work with ACI World was the release of the policy brief on airport charges and regulation. And one of the key items is that policies on airport charges should ensure they serve the best interests of the traveling public and local communities. And a new approach towards airport charges is needed. We need to move from the cost-based prices on a cost line basis to market-based prices. So that's the cost-based prices are recovering just historical operating and capital costs of the airport, typically setting cost-based charges for each cost grouping, to market-based prices. And that's looking at things that properly reflect the value of scarce capacity, pricing to recover costs, but also manage capacity efficiently, ensuring that pricing increases connectivity and capacity utilization, reflecting the competitive landscape, and incentivizing the reduction in noise and emission externality impacts. Next slide, please. Some of the key findings from the policy brief were that airports and airlines have changed dramatically since charges policies were first introduced. You've had airline deregulation, privatization and consolidation, and privatized commercial airport governance models, increased competition between airports. As mentioned, airport charges per passenger have been declining. Airport charges are still a small share of the average ticket price. Airports still have an important role in tackling both local and global environmental impacts. So that's things like noise and emissions. And despite the impact of COVID-19, there is still a long-term need for capacity expansion to meet future demand. Next slide, please. The policy brief included a number of policy recommendations, namely government policies on charges need to ensure that they serve the best interests of the consumer. We want to ensure policies incentivize sustainability, efficiency, investment in infrastructure, and generate socioeconomic benefits for the airport communities and their surroundings. Airports have a right to set and collect charges for airport facilities. Strictly cost-based charges should be reconsidered and looking more at the demand side, as cost-based only does not provide the right incentives and signals. The primary focus of charges should be on market needs and signals. You want to provide the correct incentives for optimal use of airport resources and investments. And the best way forward is through commercial agreements between airports and airlines. And this has been successful in a number of jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Any economic oversight function should evaluate the degree to which an airport is subject to competition in various sectors. As well, the economic oversight function should evaluate the degree to which airlines can exercise countervailing power regarding airport charges. Consideration of whether to regulate or to continue to regulate an airport should be subject to a cost-benefit analysis. Regulation should only occur if the benefits outweigh the costs. When regulation is necessary, light-handed regulation should be preferred. And when airports are regulated, dual-till regulatory approaches should be considered favorably. For the Latin America, Caribbean region specifically, as part of the work for ACI World, we completed a survey of airports in the region, asking what their top policy issues were in light of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for the region, the following were the top answers: the inability to adjust prices rapidly and in a flexible manner, the inability to attract new financing, and the inability to adjust price cap for new reduced forecasts of traffic. So the issues that the airports in the region noted were largely around the inability of the airports to plan for how things will go in the future. Next slide, please. As mentioned, one of the key policy recommendations was around the use of dual till. So we provide here some information on single versus dual till policies. Airport revenues fall into two categories. You have aeronautical revenues from fees for the use of the runway and terminals, things like landing fees, terminal fees, passenger fees. Non-aeronautical revenues, and that's your net income from passenger purchases of food, beverage, retail, parking, and really anything that's not in the aeronautical revenue sector. Under single till, non-aeronautical net revenues are used to offset and reduce aeronautical charges. And under dual till, aeronautical charges must fully cover aeronautical costs. There's no offset. Next slide, please. As part of the work, we did analysis looking at the average airport charges per passenger using aeronautical revenue as a proxy across the different types of tills, so dual till, single till, and hybrid till. And one of our key findings was that airports with single till policies are not observed to have lower charges per passenger than airports with dual tills. That further backs the idea that dual till charges are preferred. I'll now pass it to Dr. Trethewey for the next slide, please.
Good morning. We want to provide a few key observations from our work. Sorry. First is that airports need to recover financial resiliency. And for those airports that are regulated, it's very important that the regulator recognizes that airports are now known to have much higher financial risk for investors. Now, for those who are involved with regulation of airports, there's a key variable, which is the weighted average cost of capital. And in assessing or determining that weighted average cost capital, there's something called the beta factor. The beta factor is essentially a measure of the riskiness on equity capital. And some work that was done actually for ACI Europe, where we have a lot of publicly traded airport equity issues. In Latin America, many of the equity investors are private holdings rather than traded on the market. But in Europe, where we could observe the betas, we note that the betas of airports have gone up by about 50% since COVID began. So that's the diagram on the left. It's the beta factors for 4 European airports: Zurich, Fraport, Frankfurt, the Spanish airports, and the main operator in France. The right hand is the beta factors for other regulated utilities. So the comparison here is regulated airports versus regulated other utilities, like electricity and gas, water. And what we see is that the riskiness of airports is higher. Now, while we focused on the beta factor for equities, it's also the case that airport debt carries a higher risk element now. And so for those of you who are regulated, it's going to be very important that you put forth strong cases that when the regulator determines the weighted average cost of capital for your price caps, that weighted average cost of capital now must reflect the revealed higher risk associated with airport assets. Next slide, please. Now, this is our concluding slide, but I did want to bring out a few really important points for you. First of all, one of the slides that Jody showed you was that airport charges are declining. This is a very important finding in our report, and it's contrary to the message being delivered by the International Air Transport Association, IATA, and the airlines individually themselves. IATA puts forth data suggesting that airport charges are growing both in terms of the total amount as well as a percent of the ticket price. But their information is distorted. First of all, it does not adjust for inflation. And so the numbers we are presenting are adjusted for inflation. Secondly, IATA tends to compare airport charges to the base fare. But the base fare has been declining, so the airport charges seem to be a larger percent. But the base fare is declining in large part because the airlines are now putting on these ancillary charges that are for things, like checking a bag, getting advanced seat assignment, and so forth. So a very important part of our analysis, and all analysis going forward, should be to adjust base airline fares by an average amount of ancillary charges. And that will vary from about 10%, in some cases 40 or 50% increase in the base charges. There's some airlines where ancillary charges now are equal to the base fare. And so that adjustment needs to be done. The last point I wanted to emphasize was about single versus dual till. And Jody had showed you a slide using data specifically for Latin America, Caribbean airports that showed that dual till airports are not the high charge airports. And often it's characterized, again by IATA, thank you, that single till airports, they claim, have the lowest charges, and therefore they want all airports to be regulated and to use single tills, where any non-aeronautical revenues are used to offset aeronautical charges. But our research shows that that's not the case. Dual till and single till airports seem to have about the same level of charges. Now, one of the claims that was made to us in the course of our studies, well, single till airports have high charges because they have the most capital expenditures. It's not on a slide here, but it is in the report that that's not the case. In fact, single till airports invest less per passenger than the dual till airports do. Now, it's interesting that the hybrid till, which is often used in Latin America, seems to have the lowest charges. So in the hybrid till, some, but not all of the non-aeronautical revenue are used to offset aeronautical costs and aeronautical charges. The hybrid till preserves the main aspect of dual till, which is the dual till gives an incentive to the airport to develop non-aeronautical revenue, as well as to increase primary airport traffic. Dual till airports, we believe, market more to develop traffic and improve connectivity for their communities. Both of these result then in lower charges. So the hybrid till, or higher revenues for the airport and higher passenger counts. The hybrid till preserves the incentives to expand airport traffic and connectivity and to generate high levels of non-aeronautical revenue, sharing some, but not all of that is offsets to the single till. And that then concludes our presentation today, and we'll be happy to address questions that come up.
Thank you, Mr. Hathaway. I'm going to share the slide where you can find the the email address to address your questions. Please remind to send the questions to this email address. We have received some of the questions, and I would like to start with this one, the first one that says, on your view on the Intervista site, what you think about the changes should be needed by the regulator going forward, sorry. Your view on changes needed
Yes.
by regulator going forward. Go ahead.
So we have a number of views on this. One is that regulators should determine whether there in fact is a benefit of regulation. We see, and I will use a specific example that we were involved in. In the case of Jamaica, it has 2 modernized airports, and they are applying a regulatory method that is essentially the same as used for London Heathrow Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. This is very expensive. It's expensive for the airport to go through the regulation process. It's expensive for the government to implement regulation, and it does not seem to produce any net benefit at all. So one of our first points would be that it's very important to for governments to actually consider whether regulation is justified. A second point I just commented on, and that is we do not believe that single till is the right approach. So where countries have an ability for the regulator to implement either a dual till or a hybrid till, that's the path that the regulator should take. Now, we understand that in some nations, the legislation requires by law that there be single till regulation, and perhaps the law should be changed, and that's a different matter. But where the regulator has discretion, the regulator should leave as much incentive as possible with the airport operator to develop non-aeronautical revenues, in part because that incentive is also an incentive to grow airport traffic. The third general point is the one I've also emphasized, and Jody showed the slide for, and that is that going forward, the regulator needs to recognize a much higher cost of capital for airports, because we now know that unlike many other sectors of the economy, air transportation in general, and airports in particular, have very high financial risk for their investors, and the airport charges need to provide a higher return for that risk. And I'll add one more other point here, because I know it's very important to a lot of airports. The question that comes up is, should regulators allow airports to recover revenues that they did not receive during the COVID experience? Our view is the answer is yes, they should. Now, there's some, we use the word caveats around that. The most important aspect is that airport charges are to cover operating expense and capital expenses. To the extent that charges were not earned during COVID for covering capital expenditures, which the regulator requires the airport to make, the airport in future years should be allowed to recover in full those foregone revenues that cover CapEx. Now, when it comes to the issue of recovering revenues that were dedicated to covering operating expenditures, there may be a bit of flexibility that perhaps airports should bear some of that risk, because there was some risk element in their weighted average cost of capital. But one thing COVID revealed for us is that operating expenses are not necessarily variable. We've seen many airports where their traffic dropped by 80% or 50%, and they were able to reduce their operating costs to some extent, but not completely. It appears to us that about 20 to 30% of operating expenses are variable, and the rest are fixed. And so it's appropriate for regulators to recognize that in future years, that airports need to recover at least a portion of the revenues that they did not earn, that portion that goes to the fixed operating expense component. So I know there's a long response, and I'll stop here and be happy to address other questions.
Thank you very much. Actually, we received another one on your views dealing with COVID recovery and regulation. You partially addressed that, but we have received other questions that you can see on the screen. What specific type of commercial arrangement between airlines?
I cannot see on the screen. Yes.
In the Q&A, what if not, I can read it. No worries.
Yeah, the Q&A is blank. Oh, I see. Now I see it. Yes.
Okay. It says, what specific type of commercial arrangement between airlines and airports are you suggesting? Is there any room for vertical integration? And just before giving you the floor for the answer, remind you that please send us the questions to the email address in order to keep track of all the questions that comes. Thank you.
So with regard to vertical integration, this is a term economists use. And in the case of aviation, what it would mean is that airlines own airports, or alternatively, airports own airlines. So my view would be, first of all, airports should never invest in airlines. They have a very different risk profile financially than airlines do. And it's a very different skill set that's required. I have seen a very few cases where airports looked at investing in airlines, and I thought that would be problematic for the airport investors to be investing in a second sector with very high risk. The question of airlines investing in airports, we understand the attraction of an airline being able to control its airport, its main hub airport. But the key word there is control. And the competition authority in nations will not like that, because their view would be then that the hub carrier would be able to control the airport's access to the airport by other airlines. And I think that it would be unlikely that a competition authority would approve more than a minority investment in a for-profit airport, or even for a not-for-profit airport. This question, to a large extent, was resolved about 50, 60 years ago, when governments were, as aviation were emerging, about whether they should have common ownership of airlines and airports. And I think the answer has been no. And that would be my own personal view, but I want to emphasize these are our views at InterVistas, not necessarily those of ACI. Now, with respect to the first part of the question about what should commercial agreements look like between airlines and airports, we think Australia has provided a really good example of how this should be done. Airports and airlines negotiate agreements between them, and those agreements will include a provision for dispute resolution when there's disputes about airport charges, and dispute resolution about levels of service. A consequence of those agreements that contain dispute resolution mechanisms in the contract itself is that there's no need for the government then to regulate the airports. Now, this is, we would say, a double-edged sword, because sometimes regulation can actually protect an airport from a bully airline, if you would let me use that word. But the key thing in the commercial agreements is that there is a provision for identifying what information the airport is to provide to the airline about the airport's operations and costs. They don't need to disclose everything, but there's certain key things that they have to do. And if that is provided for in a commercial agreement, there's no need for a regulator to also intervene. And then dispute resolution on fares. But there also has to be an understanding of what the level of service to be provided by the airport is. We've been doing work with a number of airports where, for example, a hub carrier wanted a high level of service, in particular around things like provision of facilities for customs and security and staffing to the extent that the airport has any control over staffing levels. And putting that in a commercial agreement then creates the opportunity for the airport to make clear that you will then pay a higher charge because we will be incurring a higher level of cost for providing that higher level of service to you. Now, in the case of Australia, the airports and airlines have reached individual agreements, different agreements with different airlines. And as a result, the government reviews every 5 years whether they need to regulate the airport. And for the last 20 years have decided that regulation is not needed because the commercial agreements are operating successfully. The commercial agreements also do not require that an airport has exactly the same charges for different airlines. They can provide different incentives to different airlines and use different charging mechanisms. Sydney, Australia Airport, for example, for a period of time used weight-based charges for one airline and passenger-based charges for another airline, and that worked out quite well for a number of years. Eventually, things changed. The airlines changed their fleets, and they're now both the major carriers are on passenger-based charges.
Thank you, Dr. Tetaway, for your answer. We have received another one asking for your views in the case of Mexico, where airlines have started promoting a campaign in the media to highlighting the high percentage of the passenger fee within the total cost of the price of the passenger ticket per flight. You briefly mentioned that, but I don't know if you have any other insight you want to share on the case of perhaps Mexico or Latin America.
Yes, so this is a very good question. So first of all, I think it's very important that the airports respond with an information campaign of their own, perhaps using information in our study, but perhaps it should be Mexico specific, saying that the airline claims are flawed, that they are hiding the fact that they have increased charges dramatically themselves through ancillary revenues. And this might be a nasty way of doing it, but saying, well, if the airports are going to be regulated, perhaps the airline charges and their ancillary charges should be regulated. As an economist, I don't like that, but it is a way to respond to this. Second is that you need to present information in inflation-adjusted terms. And third, you also have to indicate what the level of capital expenditure has been. One key aspect about airports is a very large percentage of their cost is actually covering capital expenditure. And in Mexico in particular, Latin America, Caribbean more generally, there is a serious capacity issue that airports need to make major investments in capital. And that means that charges are going to be higher. We could keep charges down by not making investments, and you will have high congestion. You will not have competition of as much airline competition at airports because of all of that congestion. And the experience in the United Kingdom has been where you have high congestion, the airline fares are also higher. A last point, which I think is very important, in saying that, look, the right way to do this is not to simply introduce regulation, but rather the government should review whether there's actually a case for regulation. Follow the example of Australia, where the government convened a small commission to investigate the issues put forward by the airlines to determine whether, in fact, the charges are in fact high or too high, and then to determine whether a cost-benefit analysis would show that there would actually be a benefit to introducing regulation. Because the evidence in Australia and other places, New Zealand, there's other places who've looked at these issues, has found that, in fact, the high charges, to the extent that they are high at airports that are making large investments, are justified because of needed capital expenditure. And introducing competition monitoring or a competition authority jurisdiction over airports and regulation would likely not produce any net benefit.
Thank you very much. Let's give some seconds for the participant to send their questions. If not, or in the meantime, I would like to share with you that the presentation will be shared with you, as well as the recording that we will post in our YouTube channel, where you will have the chance to see again or share with your colleagues the recording of this webinar. For the moment, I think we don't receive, we are not receiving further questions. I don't know, Jody, Mr. Thetaway, you want to make comment on one specific question before finalizing the webinar? If not, we're still open to receive the question, and perhaps we can share it by the end of the webinar to our speakers to address them.
I would like to make one more observation, and that is that when we look globally at the impact of COVID and recovery, I wanted to observe that we are seeing the Americas, Latin America and North America are recovering from COVID faster than the rest of the world. The impacts were very deep in Latin America, but Latin America has a faster pace of recovery. The one exception in the Americas is Canada, which is lagging because of very severe government restrictions on air travel. The United States right now is about 80 to 85% recovered. The domestic market is largely recovered, and it's the intercontinental market that is much slower. But Latin America is doing much better than almost all the rest of the world. The Americas are how do I phrase it? They are remarkable in that air travel is recovering quite quickly here, and Latin America is the region that's expected to have one of the highest rates of growth going forward. We do not expect that Latin America will be fully recovered by the end of 22, but perhaps by the end of 2023, the region will be fully recovered and returning toward long-term trend, where Latin America and Asia are the two regions that are going to have the fastest growth. North America and Europe will not have, they are mature markets, and they will not be achieving rapid growth in the coming 20 years. Jody, anything that you might want to add further about anything about our presentation?
No, Mike, thank you. I think you've covered the extra pieces we wanted to add in.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Thetaway, Ms. Jody Kositsky, for your time preparing these slides and sharing your experience and knowledge. And thank you all the participants for joining us in this webinar today. As mentioned, we will be sharing these slides as well as the recording during the day. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.